The Soviet Union, one of the formidable forces of the 19th and 20th centuries, met their end in a rather unfathomable way. While this force was conquering countries and making a name for itself, the countries that make up the Union felt it was time to go their separate ways. Change in itself is constant, and there would come a time when one would want to grow on one's own. The countries that formed the Soviet Union felt the need to honor and safeguard their sovereignty, hence their separation. In today's video, we will be giving you a detailed analysis of the Soviet Union, how it was formed, the countries that formed the Union, and why the Union collapsed. We would also be looking at some factors that necessitated the fall of the Iron Curtain. But before we begin, thank you for choosing to watch another one of our amazing videos. To enjoy more of these videos, subscribe to Economics Reasons and click the notification bell to get a front row seat. Now, let's begin. A great many theories have been formed pertaining to the collapse of the Soviet Union. These theories range from economic, political, and social factors, and they take their roots from the failed reforms the Union engaged in. Before we go into why this once formidable force crashed, let us go into what the Union is, the ideology behind its formation, and the countries that made up the Union. This Union is recognized in history as one of the strongest and most rugged unions ever formed. Originally known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, his union was a communist state that scanned much of Eurasia. The Union was formed on the 30th of December, 1922. Before that time, however, there were 4 independent socialist republics that posed as foreigners of the Union. These countries include the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, and Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. The movement of this union began on August 18 in 1991 and on December 31 in 1991. It was nominally a federal union of 15 national republics. However, in practice, the government of the Union and economy were highly centralized until its final years. The Union was a one-party state governed by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, with Moscow as its capital within its largest and most populous republic, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. The participants in the Union include Armenia, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, and Ukraine. The population of the Soviet Union numbered more than 290 million, and 100 distinct nationalities lived within its borders. It also boasted an armory of millions of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union grew tremendously, and its sphere of influence exerted through such mechanisms as the Warsaw Pact extended throughout Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union collapsed a year into its formation. While it is, for all practical purposes, difficult to identify a sole cause for an event as complicated and far-reaching as the dissolution of a global superpower, several internal and external factors were certainly at play in the collapse of the USSR or the Soviet Union. For a union formed by countries that have surrendered a large amount of their sovereignty to the government of the Union, there was bound to be political upheaval in the Union. This will not be born out of the scramble for control, a difference in ideas, and ultimately, internal wars between and amongst the political class. During the reign of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union from March 11 in 1985, there was a need to create a more sustainable Soviet policy in the face of dwindling communism. The primary intentions of Mikhail were to jumpstart the comatose economy of the Soviet Union and to facilitate the massive government bureaucracy. These goals were born out of the need to constitute a stronger and more firm union within the word community. The economy and politics of the Soviet Union were in shambles, and if the reform was not careful and practically done, then a collapse would be inevitable. However, the attempts at reform failed, and there arose the need for a more intuitive and pragmatic approach to tackle the problem of the Union. The General Secretary created the policies of glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, which means restructuring. Glasnost was intended to enable dialogue, and perestroika was intended to introduce semi-free market policies to government-run industries. This system was going against all that communism stood for, but it was supposed to at least create an innovative form of communism. Rather than provoking a rebirth in communist thought, glasnost unlocked the floodgates to criticism of the entire Soviet apparatus. The Soviet Union lost control of both the media and the public sphere, and democratic reform activities gained power throughout the Soviet Union. Perestroika expressed the poorest of the capitalist and communist systems. Price controls were raised in some markets, but existing bureaucratic structures were left in place, meaning that communist officials were able to push back against those policies that did not benefit them personally. In the end, Mikhail's reforms and his forsaking of the Brezhnev Doctrine accelerated the extinction of the Soviet Empire. Countries that made up the Union sensed an imminent collapse of the power structures. They began to take measures that would ensure their stability during and after the fall. By the end of 1989, Hungary had broken down its boundary fence with Austria. Solidarity had swept into power in Poland. The Baltic states were taking tangible steps toward independence, and the Berlin Wall had been toppled. The Iron Veil had fallen, and the Soviet Union would not long outlast it. Although the reform and structures put in place by the General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, made headway, an unforeseen collapse led to the fall of the Union. By some standards, the Soviet economy was the world's second largest in 1990. However, deficits in consumer goods were routine and hoarding was commonplace. It was calculated that the Soviet black market economy was equal to more than 10% of the country's official GDP. Economic stagnation had staggered the country for years, and the perestroika reforms only served to worsen the crisis. The hikes in wages were aided by printing cash, creating massive inflation. Mismanagement of fiscal strategy made the country susceptible to external factors, and a sharp drop in the price of oil sent the Soviet economy into a tailspin. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union indexed as one of the world's top producers of energy resources such as oil and natural gas, and exports of those commodities played a crucial part in shoring up the world's largest command economy. Sadly, when oil plummeted from $120 a barrel in 1980 to $24 a barrel in March 1986, this significant lifeline to external capital shriveled. The price of oil temporarily changed in the wake of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. But by that point, the collapse of the Soviet Union had become really tangible. It is a generally held belief that Soviet defense spending increases drastically in reaction to the presidency of Ronald Reagan and ideas such as the Strategic Defense Initiative. The Soviet military budget had been spiraling upward since at least the early 1970s. But Western analysts were left with best guesses concerning hard numbers. External measures of Soviet military spending varied between 10 and 20% of GDP, and, even within the Soviet Union itself, it was hard to produce a precise analysis because the military budget involved different government ministries, each with its own competing interests. What can be said definitively, however, is that military spending was invariably agnostic of overall economic trends. Even when the Soviet economy crept, the military stayed well-funded. Furthermore, the military took precedence when it came to the research and development of talent. Technological innovators and would-be entrepreneurs who could have helped support Gorbachev's partial transition to a market economy were instead channeled into defense industries. The Soviet Union began as a group of countries that share boundaries trying to assert their voice in the global community. It grew into a global power, but because of differences in ideology, economic, military, as well as social factors, collapsed. It is, however, important to note that there were internal alliances, pacts, and plans before the Union finally fell. The countries involved began to lead an independent life, although still in the shadow of their communist past. That is all we can take in today's video. Let us know what you think about the Soviet Union, its creation, ideology, and its collapse in the comment section below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to get more details, insights, and facts bordering on history, geography, politics, and economics. See you in the next.